Some people love trials, and I'm not talking about the lawyers or the jurors or police or bailiffs or even judges here. I'm talking witnesses and sometimes even accused criminals. That is, there are people for whom a trial is an opportunity, perhaps their only opportunity, to be heard, to command an audience, to feel real and alive. Today's podcast arises from a piece that I wrote for Standpoint magazine for the July-August summer bumper issue, and the piece is about fake hate crime. This is quite a short podcast, and the reason for that is because you're going to be putting up with quite a lot of me all on one day. That is, I need to make an announcement, and very briefly, the announcement is that I will be appearing this evening at 6 p.m. There will be a premiere on the Trigonometry podcast talking about the Australian election result. Now, obviously, the Australian election result was quite a while ago, and for those of you who've been following my podcast, you would know that I did one about it quite a while ago, and I've done a couple since, so this is a while ago. So a few warnings are in order. I'm quite pleased with it. It was a good interview, and Constantine and Francis are very funny and very talented, and they ask good and thoughtful questions, and it's a very easy environment to be interviewed in, but of course it works on the principle that if you give a person enough rope, eventually they'll hang themselves. I hope I haven't done that, but I should warn you that it was recorded on the 24th of May, which is the day after the European Parliament elections, and you will be hearing it on the 30th of June. So some of the information in there is quite stale, and I'd like to alert you to two aspects of it. The first and most obvious aspect, it'll be the bits that you've already seen, is my comments about Israel Folau, the rugby player. That story really was only part of Australian politics at the time. It hadn't really gone global, except maybe to New Zealand, and also it had gone to rugby fans as well. It hadn't really reached the news services like the BBC or the Wall Street Journal or more widely in the UK. And that was simply because it just hadn't blown up by that point. And so there were a lot of things that I was commenting on in a very broad and very general way that I simply couldn't predict the future. I didn't know what was going to happen with Israel Folau and that it was going to become an enormous global story, which is what has happened now. So take that for what it is worth, because more information has become available. And because I can't predict the future, I didn't have access to that information. And to a degree, this also applies to some of my commentary on the Australian election itself. Because it was recorded on the 24th of May, not all of the seats had even been declared, because the election was only on the 18th of May. So there was still information to come in about lower house seats, House of Representatives seats, and the Senate was nowhere near fully counted. So there's a bit of speculation in there from me, because I was having to make educated guesses based on partial information, and in a couple of spots I've been wrong. But do watch it anyway, because one of the things I have done, which isn't dependent on being able to predict the future or pick polls or forecast which seat is going to go where in the Senate, one of the things I have done is give a good, clear explanation of the Australian electoral system and how it works, and described how Australian elections work. And I think that information is just useful anyway, and that doesn't change. So that's all completely accurate. And it's well worth watching the Trigonometry podcast, in my view, because I'm a terrible Australian politics nerd and electoral systems nerd. I think it would be worth your while to watch it just to find out how this very distinctive and unusual electoral system works. But today's podcast, very briefly, and I'm only going to spend about 10 minutes talking about this, based on my Standpoint piece on fake hate crimes. Now, this has been all over the news recently, and there's been extremely high-profile cases like the whole of Operation Midland, like the Jussie Smollett case in the US, like the Michael Kedar case in Israel, and partly the US, but mainly in Israel. So extraordinary high-profile cases where entire large numbers of trials have collapsed, and it's been just a general disaster. Now, one of the effects of these false hate crimes and false reporting, criminal reporting generally, has been to undermine a number of narratives like believe all women and you should always accept a person from a racial or religious or sexual minority's definition of what it is to experience bigotry or prejudice. Now, those narratives have been largely destroyed. What I'm going to do in today's podcast is point out that they should never have arisen in the first place, but not for the reasons that you think. And I'm going to base a bit of this on my legal experience, but I'm also going to recommend a book. But unfortunately, the book is only an analysis of American hate crime hoaxes. And it's by a gentleman called Professor Wilfred Reilly, who's also a lawyer, but he's now a professor of political science at Kentucky State University. And he has written a book called Hate Crime Hoax: How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. His book mainly focuses on race, and all his case studies are American. And he also concedes that it's quite difficult to come up with a detailed statistical analysis, although he is working on this to the greatest extent he can, of just what percentage of hate crime reports are actually fake, because they have a background, there's a hinterland to this, of what percentage of all crime reports, regardless of what the crime is, whether it's everything from car theft to burglary to assault to rape to whatever, what percentage of all crime reports are actually fake. And this is something that I need to give you a bit of background on, because it's a phenomenon that's well known to lawyers, and it's why we really shouldn't have been paying as much attention as we have been paying to all of these reports of hate crimes, because we really, really badly got the wrong end of the stick, and not enough people in policy making listened to members of the legal profession when these ideas were developed, because they're simply wrong and they need to be removed from our understanding of recording crime, because they're actually making a problem that's existed in developed legal systems for northwards of 2,500 years. I mean, I'm going to give you some case studies that go back to classical antiquity. Now, what you need to understand in this context is that some people love trials, to go back to my introduction, which seems bizarre. One of the things a solicitor or a barrister, or in America an attorney, an advocate or a notary in European Union countries, one of the things you're always trying to do with clients is to calm them down and encourage them to be less belligerent. You want to keep them out of court. And some people have a personality that means they love court. They want to go to trial. They want to be seen. They want to be in front of the judge. They want to be able to perform and be in this particular position where people are forced to listen to them. And they're not hugely common in the population, but they're common enough to create a particular phenomenon. And this is something I witnessed from literally my first day as a pupil barrister, where you turn up I did in my case, I turned up in my very hot robes because they're made of wool, and I did my first practitioner year as a pupil barrister in country Queensland, in regional Queensland, and it was boiling hot, and I started my job in January, and I think it was about 40 degrees, and I just remember walking into the courthouse and being boiling hot. But that was not the thing that I most remember. The thing that I most remember is all these people hanging around the courthouse, because in Rockhampton, where I did my first practitioner year, the Magistrates Court, the District Court and the Supreme Court, which are the three tiers of the hierarchy, and I was in the Supreme Court, but the three tiers of the hierarchy are all in the one building, so you get all the little tiddly traffic matters, and you get sex offences, and you get burglaries and serious assaults, and you also get murder and big drugs offences, and they're all in the one building, and the courtrooms are on different floors. And people were just bowling up to lawyers and asking them, oh, is there a rape on today? Is there a murder on today? And it became clear to me that people were hanging around the courthouse with a view to making a spectacle out of trials. They were treating it as like a theatre show, but they didn't have to pay for it, of course. It was free. Anyone, unless you have a closed court for a terrorism matter or a surveillance matter, anyone can go and sit in the public gallery of a courtroom as long as it's not full. The court staff will give priority to journalists and relatives of the accused and so on and so forth. But most of the time, these places aren't full and you can just go in and sit in there. Now, people who are massively invested in seeing or participating in a trial do a number of things to contrive to land in court by any means possible, although the most common involve making false crime reports to the police or bringing frivolous civil claims. These have particular names and particular histories. Non-lawyers, as I mentioned, are always astonished when I say this. I suspect it's only accepted because I am a lawyer and can describe what I've seen. There are offences on the books to deal with this. They're called wasting police time, which is the less serious one, and the more serious one is perverting the course of justice, and that's the kind of thing that is happening in the wake of the collapse of all the Operation Midland investigations. Nick, Carl Beach, is now being investigated for perverting the course of justice. Now, there's also a civil courts equivalent. This is when people are making sort of contractual claims or succession claims or family claims or property claims, and that's called when an individual persistently brings pointless and silly claims in court, because people don't realise that court filing is relatively inexpensive. It's a few £100, maybe $500. It's often very inexpensive. It's the cheapest part of a court case. And when people do it in the civil area of law, which is a private litigation, it's called vexatious litigation or frivolous litigation. And people who do it repeatedly can be declared vexatious litigants, which is a very, very serious thing to be accused of, because it deprives you of, prima facie, it deprives you of your ability to access the courts, which is a very, very serious ruling to make. But if you don't have the capacity to declare some people vexatious litigants, they just drive everybody up the wall. They drive the court staff up the wall, they drive bailiffs up the wall, they drive the people who look after filing of documents up the wall, they drive other lawyers up the wall, and they make the most extraordinary claims. To give you an example from a friend of mine who used to be a banking litigator, and that meant that she worked for banks, and one of the things banks do is take possession of people's property when they can't make their mortgage repayments or other kinds of repayments. And you would get individuals turning up to court defending themselves against the bank on the basis of, say, Magna Carta, and saying that your bank is improperly constituted because of something in Magna Carta. It was quite extraordinary, the frivolous claims that would be made because an individual was attempting to stop the mortgagee, in this case the bank, from exercising its power of sale, which is kind of like the Australian and British equivalent of what the Americans call foreclosure, although the legal things are different because foreclosure actually involves the bank taking ownership of the property, whereas power of sale doesn't necessarily involve doing that. Now, I've had to explain this a lot lately because of the fake hate crime situation. People who bring frivolous claims or who go to the police station with made-up crimes, this is centuries old. These people have always existed. We have a story from ancient Athens of Pisistratus, who actually became one of the tyrants of Athens, who secretly beat himself up and made himself look all wounded, and then was walking around the Agora, which was like the public square in Athens, and everybody was feeling really sorry for him. He was like, "Oh, this is dreadful, you've had the snot beaten out of you, this is awful." And as a result of what he did, he was given bodyguards paid for out of the city purse, out of the public purse, because Athens was a city-state. And he was a very charming and charismatic person, Pisistratus, and he used those people who'd been allocated to him as bodyguards as the backbone of a group of individuals to actually take power in the Athenian state as a tyrant, as one of the Greek tyrannos, as one of the Greek tyrants. So that's very early. This is like 2,500 years ago. We've also got records of Roman jurists complaining about individuals hanging around courthouses looking for frivolous reasons to bring suit. We've got Roman records of people making false claims to the vigiles, which was the Roman police force. So this is a very, very old problem. These kind of people have always existed, and lawyers have always known this. I mean, this is not hard to find this kind of information. Pisistratos' case is extremely well documented. The Roman jurists talking about this, lawyers going back in common law systems like the United States, Australia and the United Kingdom. All the rules about how to declare someone a vexatious litigant, all of this information is publicly available and easy to find. It's not some sort of cult or craft amongst lawyers. We're not sneakily keeping it to ourselves. This is a thing. People make fake crime reports. People bring silly and vexatious civil claims, and you need to find a way of weeding them out of the system, or otherwise you will blow up the system. It will collapse under its own weight, which is what is starting to happen with all the fake hate crime. And the reason it's starting to happen is because people are told, typically police officers, and if you look at the hate crime operational guidance from the College of Policing, the police are told that they have to believe these individuals who make hate crime complaints. And some of the complaints mechanisms, like True Vision, for example, the individual can make a complaint and then forbid police follow-up, but that complaint is still added to the hate crime statistics. So it just means that every large data set of hate crime data that you get is corrupted, and the only way you can work out whether there's any throughput is if you go to the Office of National Statistics. This is in the United Kingdom, and in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I presume the Department of Justice does this in the US. I don't know how their system works, though, to see whether there's any throughput, to see whether conviction rates have gone up. And we now know that conviction rates haven't gone up. In fact, they've actually dropped. So that gives you an idea that there's this huge gulf between what is being reported to the police and then what is going to trial, because it then has to be filtered through normal procedural rules, the rules of evidence, the rules of trial, and the rules of court, and so on. So I just want to make the point that this characteristic, it's a psychological characteristic, I presume. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a lawyer. It's sort of attention-seeking or narcissistic behaviour of some sort or another, where people go to the police or bring frivolous claims, is quite widespread. We don't know how widespread it is, although I suspect people like Professor Wilfred Riley at Kentucky State University, if anyone's going to nail it down, at least in his own jurisdiction where he's an expert, then someone like him will. But I'm sure there's other people in the United Kingdom and in Australia doing research in this area. There's certainly been lots of stuff written about vexatious litigants over many years by academic and practitioner lawyers. I'm just going to give you an example of how elaborate these kind of things can be. The expression that I use in my Standpoint piece is as well planned as the 1983 Brinksmat heist, for those of you who are old enough to remember the huge robbery at Heathrow a few years ago, and they never recovered all of the gold and lots of it sort of disappeared into the ether and everyone kind of wonders why. First of all, I'll tell the story of Michael Khadr, for example. This is just a classic. Michael Khadr phoned in hundreds of bomb threats to Jewish community centres, first in the US, then globally. To do it, he ran a phone bank out of his home, masking his caller ID using a service called Spoof Card and paying for it using Bitcoin rather than a traceable credit card or PayPal. He routed the calls through anonymous proxy servers overseas, sending the FBI on multiple wild goose chases. Meanwhile, the bomb threats continued and even intensified. Jewish care homes and day schools were being evacuated almost daily as a result of this. The threats were seen as evidence at the time that anti-Semitic fringe groups were emboldened by Donald Trump's election. It was only when Khadr accidentally forgot to use his proxy server disclosing a real IP address, location Ashkelon, Israel, that police finally traced it to a Wi-Fi point the teenager was accessing through a giant antenna pointed out of his bedroom window. Needless to say, the Israel police and the FBI were not best pleased. Closer to home, Operation Midland was a skein of horrors that cost the Metropolitan Police hundreds of thousands of man-hours and an as-yet unknown sum in compensation to those wrongfully accused of running a VIP pedophile ring. The investigation itself finished up costing more than £2.5 million, while former Tory MP Harvey Proctor, who was falsely accused of rape and murder and lost his house and job as a result, is thought to be seeking more than £500,000 in damages for loss of earnings and damage to his reputation. Now, those two cases were huge. They're probably the two biggest ones I can think of, and I also would contend that they're bigger than the Jussie Smollett case. Jussie Smollett's case only became so huge, the story only became so huge because he is famous. He's an actor in Empire. But what was done with Operation Midland and what Michael Khadr did from Israel was just so big and involved so many people and went on for such a long time. It was just hideous. So that gives you an idea of what these people who are really obsessed with the court system and really obsessed with being integrated into the court system, whether they appear as a witness or are the accused and wanting to be the centre of attention. People can do this quite a lot and it can become very serious. And it's a phenomenon, it's real. Now, there's a basic principle of economics, and this is something you really, really need to keep in your head because it's very, very well documented, that you get more of what you subsidise and less of what you tax. Which means if you tell people that they're going to automatically be believed when they bring a claim or when they make a complaint, you will get more of them. And this is an extremely silly and destructive idea and ultimately undermines the legal system. It undermines people's faith in the legal system, and it also means when you do get genuine instances of crimes of this type, people's filters go up. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I'm sceptical anyway. I'm paid to be sceptical. That's what lawyers are for. That's why you have them. That's part of the job of our profession, is to be even-handed and to balance up both sides and to see how strong an argument argument is. Going right back to Cicero, he was a famous Roman lawyer. Lawyers have advised their pupils that they're training, or advised young lawyers, or just told people generally, as Cicero did, the first thing you should do is prepare your opponent's case before you prepare your own. You steel man your opponent. You don't straw man your opponent. You try to find out how strong their argument is, because then that will give you a better idea of how to construct your own case. It's a very important part of the legal profession, and it's ancient. Cicero was writing and giving this advice over 2,000 years ago. So the point that I'm making here, and I'll wind up now, is that this is a very bad idea, and I don't know who thought it up. And maybe someone like Helen Pluckrose could explain to you that it's come as a result of intersectionality or as a result of postmodernism or so on and so forth. I don't know where it's come from, but the idea that you should believe everyone who bowls up to a police station and makes a criminal allegation is completely balmy, and telling police officers they're not allowed to use their heads, particularly experienced detective constables and people like that, and then later on trying to tell courts that they're not supposed to use their heads, is just an extraordinarily silly idea, and it needs to be ended as soon as possible. I mean, my intuitive instinct is just to abolish the entire category of hate crime. A crime is a crime. If you go up to someone and punch them on the nose and knock them out, and they've got a blood nose and it's colonising their face, which is what happens when you get a broken nose. The fact that the person did it because they hated you for whatever reason, you know, whether it's because you vote Tory or whether you or vote Labour, or whether it's because you're black or brown, or whether it's because they think you're gay, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. The only logical place I can see for hate crime being useful is it can be used in evidence once a conviction has been secured for the actual crime at sentence. Because if someone goes around punching people on the nose, for example, because they're gay, then that could be important when it comes to sentence, because it will tell you whether that individual is capable of rehabilitation. Lots of people, lots of young men especially, who are young and bits of hellraisers and get into punch-ups out in front of the pub and spend a bit of time as a guest of Her Majesty, finish up coming good eventually, because they're fundamentally just wild boys and they grow up. But if you're in the business of trying to tell the difference between someone who's a wild boy who is one day going to grow up and someone who is a homophobe or a white supremacist, then you need to find out at sentence, because at that point you could probably send the homophobe or the white supremacist who goes around punching people to jail for longer, on the basis that a lot of work is going to have to be done to train him out of the behaviour or out of the thinking that says it's okay to go around and punch people on the nose who are not like him. That's the only place I can realistically think that you can use hate crime as a category. You use it at sentence and give a stiffer sentence to someone who's harder to rehabilitate. However, I could be wrong on that, and I look forward to Professor Wilfred Riley writing more on this, because he's got lots of good ideas, and also other people in other countries and practitioners in places like the Law Quarterly Review or Modern Law Review and so on and so forth, which are sort of high-end journals and magazines that lawyers read amongst themselves. So we'll see what happens there with that. But it's very important that this is an extraordinarily silly idea. You make the problem worse. Increased appetites grow by what they feed on, and we are currently subsidising victimhood and taxing resilience by having these kinds of believe the victim, definition of racism, definition of sexual assault, so on and so forth. These rules are very foolish. They're well-intentioned, but they're foolish. You don't want to subsidise something like this, because it's very costly and it undermines the legal system. And it also leads to terrible miscarriages of justice, like the Liam Allen case, like Operation Midland, like what happened to Harvey Proctor, like what happened to all those Jewish care homes where Jews in America thought that there really was a bunch of white supremacists and neo-Nazis running around trying to absolutely scare, excuse my French, 7 bells of shit out of American Jews. So you really don't want to encourage this kind of narcissistic personality where people who, for whatever reason, and normal people are not like this, even lawyers are not necessarily like this, who would prefer to stay out of court and try to negotiate matters through to settlement, people who are obsessed with the legal system, you just don't want to encourage them, because you will just foul up the system and create all sorts of social problems. And the police, like the Israel police and the FBI in the wake of the Kedar case, have very strong grounds to be very, very annoyed about this kind of behaviour. It's really unacceptable, and it's very costly, and it stops them being able to solve real crimes. So look out for me on Trigonometry this evening, British summertime. That is at 6 p.m. It'll be a premiere, but do be aware it was recorded a month ago and some information has moved on. But I am particularly proud of the explanation of the Australian electoral system, and I encourage you to watch it particularly for that aspect. Thanks very much.